14 hours ago, something happened at the edge of our solar system that no astrophysical model on Earth predicted, no simulation anticipated, and no textbook has ever described. NASA's Deep Space Network recorded a telemetry anomaly tied to an object called 3I Atlas, and the data attached to that anomaly carries a 0.01% probability of natural origin. That is not a rounding error. That is a verdict. And what triggered it was not a collision, not an explosion, not a gravitational slingshot. It was a theft, a precisely executed, surgically calibrated extraction of atmosphere from another world. Here's exactly what the instruments recorded. At 4:18 UTC, as 3I Atlas moved through the outer reaches of our solar system near the orbital neighborhood of Pluto, something extraordinary happened. Instead of passing through Pluto's thin exosphere the way any inert high-velocity object should, punching through like a bullet through fog and leaving nothing but turbulence behind, this object stopped shedding mass and started acquiring it. It pulled a concentrated, perfectly directed ribbon of pure nitrogen gas straight from Pluto's atmosphere. Not scattered, not disrupted, funneled. Exactly 33 million tons of nitrogen extracted with surgical precision in just 3 hours. Pause on that number. 33 million tons. Lifted from a dwarf planet's exosphere by an object moving at 87 kilometers per second, transferred without chaotic dispersal, and retained. The calculated probability of random cometary mechanics producing that outcome, a perfectly calibrated directed intake of gas at those velocities, is 1 in 8.4 billion. That figure was not estimated loosely. It was computed from the fluid dynamics data and cross-referenced against every documented comet interaction in the historical record. There is nothing like it. The conventional model of interstellar objects is built on a simple premise. These bodies are passive. They are inert masses of ice and dust responding blindly to gravity and solar radiation. They lose material. They do not gather it. They scatter atmospheres. They do not collect them. What 3I Atlas did on April 10th, 2026 violates that premise so completely that mission directors at the European Space Agency initiated emergency observation protocols the same night. When an institution that has spent decades mapping celestial mechanics restructures its observation schedule in response to a single telemetry reading, the data behind that decision demands our full attention. From a fluid dynamics standpoint, the mechanics of this transfer break down the moment you examine them closely. Moving gas through a vacuum at relative velocities of 87 kilometers per second without dispersal requires a directional force, something that concentrates and guides the flow rather than allowing it to dissipate. That is not a description of gravitational drift. That is a description of a controlled intake mechanism. And if the natural fluid dynamic models cannot account for a 1 in 8.4 billion funneling event, then the alternative forces us to ask a question that mainstream astronomy has historically resisted. What if this object is not passive at all? The implications branch in two directions, and neither is comfortable. If this is somehow a natural hydrodynamic anomaly we have never documented before, then the rule book governing how planetary atmospheres interact with high-speed interstellar objects must be rewritten from scratch. But if no natural model can accommodate what the instruments recorded, then what we are observing is a localized, controlled acquisition of resources by an object that chose to collect them. And that framing changes everything about what 3I Atlas actually is. This is where the story begins, because the nitrogen extraction was not the end of the anomaly sequence. It was the first step. What the instruments found inside that stolen atmosphere over the days that followed is where the data stops being merely unusual and starts being genuinely inexplicable. To understand the full weight of what happened on April 10th, you first need to understand what 3I Atlas is, or more precisely, what it was supposed to be. It was discovered on August 14th, 2025, by the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System in Hawaii, making it the third confirmed interstellar visitor ever detected passing through our solar system, following Oumuamua in 2017 and Borisov in 2019. At first glance, the classification seems straightforward. A third interstellar wanderer, originating from beyond our solar system, passing through on a hyperbolic trajectory. Remarkable by definition, but not immediately alarming. Then the measurements came in with more precision, and the classification began to fall apart. The object spans roughly 4.2 kilometers across, smaller than Oumuamua in some estimates, but dense, unusually dense. And from the moment of its detection, it refused to behave the way interstellar bodies are supposed to behave. As it moved closer to the inner solar system, where solar radiation should have begun heating its surface and triggering sublimation, the process by which ice converts directly to gas and forms the characteristic tail of a comet, 3I Atlas produced nothing: no water vapor, no carbon monoxide, no outgassing signature of any kind. It remained entirely inert, maintaining a uniform surface temperature of negative 240 degrees Celsius. Not approximately that temperature, precisely that temperature, held constant regardless of changes in solar proximity. That kind of thermal control is not something passive objects achieve. A standard icy body approaching a heat source warms up because it has no mechanism for managing its own temperature. It absorbs radiation and responds accordingly. 3I Atlas did not respond. It maintained thermodynamic equilibrium as though something beneath its crust was actively regulating the surface conditions. That was the baseline strangeness that preceded everything else. The real sequence of anomalies began when the object crossed the orbit of Neptune and entered the Kuiper belt, heading outbound. At that point, at 87 kilometers per second relative velocity, it approached Pluto. Classical orbital mechanics are very clear about what should happen when a transient high-velocity object passes through a dwarf planet's exosphere. The interaction should be brief, chaotic, and one-directional. The passing body disrupts the thin atmospheric layer and continues on its trajectory, leaving a wake of dispersed gas behind it. Nothing is transferred coherently. Nothing is retained. On April 10, 2026, NASA's James Webb Space Telescope, specifically the NIRSPEC instrument, detected a nitrogen signature trailing exactly 412 kilometers behind 3I Atlas. Not a dispersed cloud, a trail. Structured, concentrated, and attached. 3 independent observatories confirmed this reading using entirely separate methodologies. JWST captured the elemental signature through near-infrared spectroscopy. The European Space Agency's Gaia spacecraft independently verified the associated gravitational microperturbation caused by the mass transfer. The Atacama Large Millimeter Array in Chile cross-referenced the thermal emission frequencies and arrived at the same result. 3 sources, 3 methods, 1 conclusion. The quantity transferred was not marginal. Exactly 33.4 million tons of diatomic nitrogen were displaced from Pluto's atmosphere and drawn into the wake of 3I Atlas in 3 hours. The analogy that comes closest to capturing this is driving a vehicle at 3 times the speed of sound past a column of smoke. And instead of scattering the smoke outward in every direction, the vehicle perfectly captures exactly half of it and accelerates away without losing a single kilometer per hour. That outcome does not happen in nature. The probability of purely gravitational mechanics producing a controlled transfer of that precision at those velocities calculates to 0.003%, and that was only the first anomaly. The second arrived less than 24 hours later, and it answered one critical question while simultaneously raising a far more disturbing one. On April 11th, at exactly 9:14 UTC, ALMA's Band 7 receivers documented the isotopic composition of the nitrogen that had been transferred from Pluto. And what the spectrometers found inside that gas was not generic interstellar nitrogen. It was not an ambiguous sample that could have originated from multiple sources. The reading showed an exact, specific ratio of nitrogen-14 to nitrogen-15, the precise chemical fingerprint unique to Pluto's atmospheric boundary layer. This was not proximity contamination. This was not instrument noise. This was a molecular signature proving, beyond any reasonable scientific doubt, exactly where this gas came from and confirming that the transfer had been targeted at a specific atmospheric layer of a specific body. The word that kept appearing in the internal communications between observatory teams was not anomalous. It was extraction, because that is what the data described. Not a collision, not a gravitational disruption, a directed removal of material from a known source with the precision of a laboratory procedure executed at cosmic scales and hyperbolic velocities. Then April 12th arrived, and the third anomaly redefined the entire situation. By 1422 UTC, Hubble's Wide Field Camera 3 recorded something that had never appeared in the documented history of cometary observation. The stolen nitrogen was not trailing behind 3I Atlas in a dispersing tail the way gas behaves when it escapes a comet's nucleus. It was compressing. The 33.4 million tons of transferred gas were condensing into a structured formation. A torus, a donut-shaped ring, orbiting the equator of 3I Atlas at a distance of just 12.5 kilometers from its surface. An interstellar object, moving at 87 kilometers per second, had captured stolen planetary gas and organized it into a stable orbital structure around its own body. To achieve that outcome, the object would need to exert a precisely calibrated directional force on 33 million tons of gas, stabilizing it within a tolerance margin of 0.005 degrees. If the applied force deviated by even a fraction beyond that margin, the gas would have scattered instantly into the surrounding vacuum. Instead, it was captured, compressed, and retained in a geometrically stable ring. The lead atmospheric dynamicist consulted by MIT stated publicly that this requires a localized magnetic containment field, a mechanism that natural comets simply do not possess under any documented conditions or theoretical models. The precision involved here is worth sitting with for a moment. Capturing and compressing tens of millions of tons of gas while traveling at 87 kilometers per second is not a feat that happens by accident. It is not the product of chaotic gravitational interaction. It demands active, sustained, directional control. And when you combine the initial extraction probability of 0.003% with the probability of the same object, then mechanically compressing that gas into an independent equatorial ring, a figure below 0.0001%. The combined statistical reality of both events occurring naturally in the same object is approximately 1 in 4.7 billion. At T-minus 18 hours before 3I Atlas would cross the Kuiper Cliff and exit optimal telescopic range, the torus was not static. It was evolving. NASA's Deep Space Network antenna, DSS, 4.3 in Australia, locked onto a new telemetry signal at 11:45 UTC, revealing that the nitrogen ring had begun rotating at 4.6 kilometers per second, a velocity entirely independent of the core object's own spin rate. The gas was rotating on its own schedule, governed by its own dynamics, mechanically segregated from the body it surrounded. In standard thermodynamics, that segregation is impossible under natural conditions. A gas ring around a natural body couples to that body's rotation through tidal forces. It does not establish an independent velocity. Yet that is precisely what the instruments showed. The question that followed from this data was the one nobody wanted to answer directly. Why does a frozen interstellar object need a pressurized nitrogen ring rotating independently around its equator? The answer to that question began emerging on April 12th at exactly 22:45 UTC, when NASA's Chandra X-ray Observatory detected something inside the nitrogen torus that the thermal models had not anticipated and could not immediately explain. The gas ring was heating up. Pluto's atmospheric nitrogen exists at temperatures around negative 230 degrees Celsius, some of the coldest conditions in our solar system. That is the temperature at which the extracted material should have remained, drifting in the deep vacuum of the outer solar system far from any significant heat source. Instead, Chandra recorded the nitrogen torus reaching 450 degrees Celsius, a temperature increase of nearly 700 degrees in a matter of minutes, while the core of 3I Atlas simultaneously maintained its steady surface temperature of negative 240 degrees Celsius, unchanged, undisturbed, perfectly cold. This thermal segregation is the element of the dataset that most severely challenges our physical models. Heat transfer in a vacuum occurs through radiation, and under natural conditions, a heating gas ring would transfer thermal energy to the body it surrounds. The two temperatures would equilibrate over time, but the instruments showed no equilibration. The nitrogen ring heated dramatically. The core body stayed frozen. The two existed in thermal isolation from each other, separated by 12.5 kilometers of space, behaving as though a barrier existed between them that prevented energy exchange entirely. 3 independent sources confirmed this reading. The same pattern that has appeared throughout this entire investigation. 3 observatories, 3 methodologies, identical conclusions, held here as well. The thermal segregation was real, consistent, and completely outside the boundaries of known thermodynamic behavior for any naturally occurring system. The numerical picture that emerges from stacking these events is staggering. The probability of a directed atmospheric extraction at 0.003%. The probability of independent equatorial ring compression below 0.0001%. Both occurring in the same object, with the additional factor of extreme thermal segregation between the ring and the core, produces a combined natural probability that approaches 1 in 4.7 billion. The director of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics stated that this data requires artificial magnetic confinement, that no natural electromagnetic process known to science produces these conditions in a body of this type, this size, at this distance from any stellar heat source. There is no solar radiation at the Kuiper belt boundary capable of superheating a nitrogen ring to 450 degrees Celsius. There is no internal volcanic activity. 3I Atlas is 4.2 kilometers across and shows no signatures of internal heat generation. There is no external energy source in the surrounding environment that accounts for a 700-degree temperature spike in contained planetary gas. The energy driving that heating is coming from somewhere inside or embedded within the system surrounding 3I Atlas itself. And the only mechanism capable of sustaining that kind of localized thermal event in a vacuum, in the absence of stellar radiation, is an active energy source operating with directed output. At T-12, hours before the object crossed beyond optimal observation range, something else appeared in the telemetry. The European Space Agency's Gaia spacecraft detected a microscopic deviation in 3I Atlas's trajectory, a shift of exactly 0.02 degrees. That was not caused by any gravitational body in the surrounding region. The force producing that deviation came from the nitrogen ring itself. The rotating, superheated gas torus was functioning as a stabilizing gyroscope, applying continuous corrective force to the object's trajectory with the mechanical effect of a guidance system. A stolen atmosphere, compressed, heated, and now actively influencing the flight path of the body that collected it. This was the data that triggered an emergency classified briefing at the Pentagon, convened within 4 hours of the detection. And this was still not the most difficult finding in the data set. On April 13, 2026, at exactly 6:22 UTC, the James Webb Space Telescope's NIRCam instrument delivered the observation that reordered every prior conclusion and forced a fundamental reassessment of what 3I Atlas is actually doing with the material it collected. The 33.4 million tons of stolen Pluto nitrogen were not simply orbiting as a compressed gas ring. The spectroscopy showed something far more structured happening at the molecular level. The nitrogen molecules were being systematically stripped of their electrons. 3I Atlas was ionizing the gas, converting cold, inert, diatomic nitrogen into energized plasma. And it was doing so with a degree of control that has no natural parallel in our documented understanding of cometary physics. The result of that ionization process was a plasma torus, a ring of supercharged, electromagnetically active material encircling the object's primary body, projecting a symmetric electromagnetic field measuring exactly 4.8 Tesla. For reference, the strongest continuous magnetic fields produced by human-built superconducting electromagnets in research settings reach between 20 and 45 Tesla. The field surrounding 3I Atlas at 4.8 Tesla is well within the range of engineered magnetic containment systems. It is far outside the range of anything a 4.2-kilometer natural cometary body can generate through any process our models recognize. Natural plasma generation requires either the intense heat output of a stellar body or the enormous magnetosphere of a gas giant like Jupiter. A small, cold, dense interstellar object converting stolen planetary nitrogen into a stable 4.8 Tesla electromagnetic plasma shield in the deep vacuum of the outer solar system has no natural explanation available to us. The lead plasma physicists consulted by Caltech stated directly that the data defies natural explanation. The precision required to ionize 33 million tons of gas without triggering uncontrolled detonation of the entire ring, to manage that process with enough control to produce a stable, symmetric electromagnetic field, is beyond the current technical capabilities of any facility on Earth. The functional logic of what this object appears to be doing, when you examine the complete sequence of documented events, is internally consistent in a way that natural processes are not. An inert, thermally controlled body maintains a cold, stable surface during interstellar transit. It approaches a planetary body in the outer solar system and extracts a specific quantity of atmospheric gas with surgical precision. It compresses that gas into an equatorial ring, rotates it independently, superheats it through an unidentified internal energy source, and then ionizes it into a structured electromagnetic field that encapsulates the primary body. The field then functions as shielding against cosmic radiation and interstellar dust, precisely the environmental hazards an object would face when accelerating back out into deep interstellar space. Every step follows from the previous one. Every capability serves a clear operational purpose. The sequence reads not like a series of random physical anomalies, but like a documented operational procedure. And within 2 hours of the plasma detection being confirmed, NASA and the European Space Agency jointly initiated what is known as a Level 1 Sentinel Directive, classifying all raw telemetry from the Deep Space Network and routing it directly to the Department of Defense. In 68 years of modern space exploration, that protocol had been invoked for a cometary object rarely, if ever. That institutional response, taken by two of the world's most rigorous scientific agencies simultaneously, reflects the magnitude of what the data contained. The question that the classified briefing has not addressed publicly, the one that the available telemetry raises but does not resolve, is the most fundamental one. What is the mechanism inside 3I Atlas that sustains and controls the plasma ionization process? Because the answer to that question determines the category of reality we are currently inhabiting. We are now at the point in this investigation where the documented evidence demands that we state clearly what the data shows, what it does not show, and what the remaining possibilities actually are. Not speculation, not dramatization. Just the verified observational record assembled across multiple instruments, multiple agencies, and multiple methodologies, placed against the framework of what our physics currently permits. What we know with absolute certainty, 3I Atlas extracted exactly 33.4 million tons of nitrogen from Pluto's atmosphere in 3 hours. The probability of that extraction occurring through natural gravitational mechanics is 1 in 8.4 billion. The extracted gas was compressed into a geometrically stable equatorial ring rotating at 4.6 kilometers per second, independent of the core body's spin. That ring was superheated to 450 degrees Celsius, while the core simultaneously maintained negative 240 degrees Celsius, a thermal segregation that violates standard models of energy transfer. The nitrogen was then ionized into a plasma torus, projecting a symmetric 4.8 Tesla electromagnetic field encapsulating the primary body. The plasma ring actively influenced the object's trajectory, producing a measurable course correction. And all of this occurred in a 4.2-kilometer object, with no known internal heat source, no stellar proximity sufficient to drive ionization, and no natural magnetosphere capable of containing plasma at those field strengths. These are documented, verified, independently confirmed observations from the most advanced telescopes currently operating. They are not contested. What remains unanswered is the mechanism, the source of energy, and the architecture of control that makes each step in this sequence possible. 3 categories of explanation remain standing. The first, 3I Atlas represents a previously undocumented class of magnetohydrodynamic interaction between high-velocity interstellar objects and planetary exospheres. If that is true, then the foundational frameworks of cometary physics, fluid dynamics in vacuum, plasma generation thresholds, and thermodynamic equilibrium all require fundamental revision simultaneously. Every model built over decades of deep space observation would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. The second, the physical behaviors documented around 3I Atlas are a manifestation of exotic quantum matter interacting with the Kuiper Belt's boundary conditions in ways our current models do not predict. If that is the explanation, then we have encountered a new state of astrophysical matter, one capable of self-organizing gas, sustaining thermal segregation, and generating structured electromagnetic fields without an identifiable energy input. That discovery alone would redefine the scope of known physics. The third possibility is the one that prompted a Pentagon briefing, a Level 1 Sentinel directive, and the classification of raw telemetry from international space agencies. If the nitrogen extraction was targeted, if the compression and ionization were controlled, if the plasma field was constructed, and the trajectory correction was deliberate. If all of this is the product of designed autonomous systems operating within a 4.2-kilometer body that has just refueled on the edge of our solar system and is now accelerating back into interstellar space, then what we have been tracking for the past several months is not a comet. It is a vessel, and it came here with a purpose. One of these three realities is not a thought experiment. One of them is the actual nature of the object that passed through our solar system, extracted material from one of our worlds, built a functioning plasma shield from that material, and is now crossing the Kuiper Cliff beyond the reach of our best instruments. Right now, as you watch this, the James Webb Space Telescope and the Atacama Large Millimeter Array are collecting every remaining data point available before 3I Atlas disappears beyond optimal tracking range permanently. The plasma shield is active. The telemetry stream is live. And whatever this object truly is, natural anomaly, exotic matter, or something engineered long before human civilization existed, it is leaving our solar system having taken something from us, and our instruments are only now beginning to understand what we witnessed. The universe just showed us something we cannot explain. The evidence is documented. The data is verified. And the question of what it means is one that will define the next era of human scientific inquiry. If this breakdown changed how you think about what is moving through our solar system right now, hit subscribe. Because as new telemetry clears classification and additional spectral data is released over the coming days, we will break down every finding the moment it becomes available. Drop your analysis in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to see the data. This is not a story that ends here. It is only just beginning.